Good morning, y'all. It's good to be back with you this morning. Good to see everybody as we continue our study through the book of Genesis. When we ended last week, we were at the end of Genesis 41. And as Genesis 41 came to a close, we saw that Joseph had finally perhaps seen things turn around. That despite having been at the lowest point, he was coming back up. That God was doing great things in the life of Joseph. And he was now in charge, second in charge in all of Egypt. And God had put him in a place to do great things to save not only Egypt, but the world from famine. And with that, the story really begins to get good. Because as we move into chapters 42 through 45, where we will be today, we get the rest of the story of Joseph. After all the things that Joseph endured because of his brothers and their evil that they had done against him. As chapter 42 begins, Joseph is finally going to have his chance to even the score. Joseph is finally going to get the opportunity to confront those good-for-nothing scoundrels for all the things that they had done to him. But wait a minute. That's not exactly how the story's going to play out. You see, Joseph is going to have an opportunity for revenge. But that's not what living a life of faith and trust in God looks like. And so this morning, I hope you'll open your Bibles to Genesis 42, and we're going to begin there and move through chapters 42 through 45. We got a lot of ground to cover this morning, and we're not going to be as much in the text as we are some weeks. So I encourage you to read that text as well. But we are going to talk about this story and see how it plays out in the rest of the story of Joseph. Well, as chapter 42 begins and 41 ends, the famine had indeed finally hit the land of Canaan. But word had reached Jacob and his family that there was grain to be had in Egypt. And so Jacob tells his sons this, and then he asks this question. It's essentially like, he says, why are you looking at each other? Like, I just told you where the food is, where the grain is. Why in the world are you standing around looking at each other? Get up and go. He says, quit standing around staring at one another. Get yourselves together and get on the road, because we need to eat. And 10 of the brothers get up, prepare, and they go down, but not Benjamin. Jacob was afraid of sending Benjamin. It seems that after the loss of what he perceived to be the death of his son Joseph, Benjamin had become his new favorite child. And he's a little hesitant to send Benjamin off. I mean, it's not really surprising. I mean, think about what happened the last time and how Joseph had never returned. Seemingly, Jacob could not endure that kind of loss again, so he doesn't send Benjamin with him. Well, the 10 brothers eventually arrive in Egypt, and they come before Joseph. But the text tells us that they do not recognize him. But again, this isn't surprising. Remember, it's been 20 plus years since they last saw their brother Joseph. By now, 20 years have passed. He has a different name. He has a different look. In 20 years of living in Egypt, he's probably picked up an Egyptian accent, or at the very least, lost his Hebrew accent. There's no reason for them to think that this man standing in front of them, this Egyptian, is their long-lost brother Joseph. But when his brothers show up, verse 9 here tells us that Joseph remembered the dreams he had had, and he realized what God was doing. He remembered those dreams that we talked about a few weeks ago, the sun and the moon and the stars, and how they all were bowing down before Joseph. And those shocks of wheat that were bowing down to Joseph, shock of wheat. And all the pieces came together. Joseph realized now that God was fulfilling a promise that he had made in those dreams. And it was happening before his eyes. But from here on, the next several chapters are going to be filled with Joseph testing his brothers in a number of ways. And there's a lot of questions that have been asked through the years about what it was that Joseph was trying to accomplish in these games and these tests. What was he doing? Well, did he really want to seek revenge on his brothers but later changes his mind? Well, that doesn't seem likely. In fact, what it seems is that the purpose of these things, these tests, these tricks, was to find out more information. He wanted to know how things looked in his family after he was gone. How was his father Jacob? How was his brother Benjamin? Did they treat his brother Benjamin the way they had treated him, or had they learned? Did they resent Benjamin the way they had resented Joseph? Had their father endured the loss of a son? Well, was Jacob in good health? Was he even still alive? All of these are the kinds of things that Joseph is trying to figure out. And so he's going to use these tests and these games and these tricks of sorts to figure out exactly what he's dealing with. Well, with that, in verse 9 of chapter 42, we see that Joseph, in encountering his brothers, charges them and accuses them of being spies. Espionage was not an insignificant or outrageous accusation. The world was experiencing a famine. Everybody wanted grain, and it is completely feasible that foreigners could have come into Egypt trying to find out where the grain was so that they could report back to their kings, whose armies could then come and plunder the grain. This was not an outrageous or off-the-wall accusation. Now, the brothers counter this charge. They say, hold on now, we are all sons of one man. Why in the world would any family risk all of their sons as spies? But Joseph arranged a test to see if this was the case. He locked the brothers up and he tells them that only one of them will be able to go home, and they're going to have to bring back the youngest brother. The one son who is not there, Joseph says, if you want me to believe you're not spies, I need to see him. Bring him back. And the rest of you are going to sit here in jail until the one brother gets back with him. But after 3 days, Joseph goes to see them in prison. He lets them go, and only one brother remains. But as Joseph has told them this new plan, he says, fine, I'll let you all go, but one of you will stay as collateral. They begin to talk through this situation. Now, they're speaking Hebrew. And they don't realize that Joseph can understand every word they are saying, because again, they don't realize he's their brother. But in this conversation, they begin to realize that their chickens are coming home to roost, so to speak, for the things they had done to their brother Joseph. That their guilt and their sin had finally caught up with them. They believed that they were being punished now for what they had done to their brother Joseph. Well, when Joseph hears this, he begins to weep. It upsets him so much that he cannot contain his tears, and he steps out of the room and he composes himself. This is going to be a common refrain in the narrative of chapters 42 through 45. That Joseph, who knows what's actually happening here, is overcome by his emotions and has to leave. Well, Joseph returns and announces that he's going to keep Simeon as the brother who stays back. Now, normally you would have kept the oldest, but in this case Reuben was the oldest. But it seems that by this point Joseph had finally realized, because of this conversation that the brothers were having, that Reuben had not been involved in the plot that resulted in his being thrown into the pit and sold as a slave. In fact, we know that Reuben had all along intended to eventually come rescue him and not allow him to be treated this way. So instead it seems that Joseph keeps Simeon, the oldest guilty brother. Well, with that, he keeps Simeon locked up, and he sends the rest of the brothers back home with their bags full of grain, but he also put the money in their sacks. As they're on their way home, they realize this, and it tells us that they were afraid. There were several reasons, I think, why they were likely afraid. One, there's the fear that the Egyptians would realize it and come after them. But I don't think it's just the fear of the Egyptians. I think they were also afraid of what would happen when their father found out. It's likely that when you come back with bags full of grain but still have your money, perhaps there would have been an accusation that the brothers had stolen the grain, that they had not obtained it legally, and they would be seen as thieves. Or perhaps more telling and not completely out of the realm of possible, perhaps their father would think that with Simeon missing and the brothers having all this silver still on them, perhaps they had sold Simeon in Egypt and turned a profit on it. After all, this was the second time that the brothers had returned home to their father, minus one brother and with a lot of silver in hand. Maybe the same thing had happened again. Well, Jacob hears this, and they tell him that Benjamin must go, but Jacob refuses. Reuben tries to intercede, but Jacob is seemingly not persuaded, especially since Reuben's plan was to offer up his own two sons rather than himself. After all, Reuben probably still has a very strained relationship with his father after his attempt to seize control of the family from Jacob, as we talked about a few weeks ago. But as we come to the beginning of chapter 43, the grain has run out. The family is again hungry. And Jacob is going to change his mind about Benjamin. But notice in chapter 43 that it's only going to be after Judah steps in. Here in chapter 43, we see that Judah is clearly becoming the leader of the family as the story progresses. Here he offers himself to his father as collateral should anything happen to Benjamin. He says, I know, Dad, you're concerned about letting Benjamin go with us, but I will put my own life on the line to keep him safe. And if anything that happens to him, that is on me. It is on my head. I will step up. I will be responsible, and I will promise you on my life that Judah will be cared for, or that Benjamin will be cared for. With this, Jacob relinquishes Benjamin into Judah's care and trust. But we're continuing to see growth out of Judah. In fact, verse 10 shows us that Judah might even be a better leader than his father. Judah there in verse 10 of chapter 43 says, had we not delayed, seemingly indicting his father Jacob as a leader and provider for his family. He says, look, we could have gone and been back twice in the amount of time we've waited if you'd have just let Benjamin go with us. Almost like, Dad, if you hadn't been so stubborn, we wouldn't have been in this situation. We wouldn't be as hungry as we are now. But you were too afraid to let us do what we needed to do. Well, finally with that, Jacob sends them on their way. But this time he sends them on their way with more money and with a host of gifts. He instructs them to pay back the grain that they did not pay for last time. He sends them with gifts to appease any Egyptian anger over the situation. But the brothers arrive back in Egypt, and the first thing they do is they throw themselves at the pity of Joseph and on his mercy, and they say, "We are so sorry we got home with our money last time. We don't know how this happened, but we have brought it back and we have all these gifts. Please accept our sincerest apologies." And Joseph says, "Hold on now. My men, we received our money." Now, that wasn't true. We know that. But Joseph says, "Don't worry about it. We received our money. These must be a gift from God." But then Joseph also throws a party. He throws a banquet. He invites the brothers into his home. And this was a bizarre thing for everybody involved. The Egyptians would have seen this as an abomination. In fact, in verse 32 there, it tells us that it was an abomination for the Egyptians to eat with the Hebrews. Historically, we know that the types of food, particularly lamb, that was a staple of the Jewish diet, was seen as a sacred object in Egyptian culture. And therefore it would have been unacceptable and offensive for Egyptians to eat such food. But this also seems very strange to the brothers, who when they are called into the ruler's house, believe they are about to get thrown in jail or worse. Surely he knows what happened about the money and he's about to just let us have it. But instead they come in and Joseph inquires about their father of whom they speak. He says, "Our father sent us back with more money and he instructed us to pay back all this." And Joseph says, "This father whom you mention, is he an old man? Is he well? Is he still alive? How's he doing?" And then he sees Benjamin. And once again, Joseph has to excuse himself so that his brothers don't see the tears that are streaming down his face as he sees his brother Benjamin for the first time in 20 years. Joseph was clearly very fond of Benjamin. In fact, he was the only full brother that Joseph had. Benjamin was the child of Joseph's mother as well, the son of Rachel, the son whom his mother had died giving birth to. The closest connection Joseph still had to his mother. And Joseph was seemingly very fond of him. In fact, we see here at dinner that Benjamin is going to be given extra portions at the meal beyond any of the rest of his brothers. And as chapter 43 comes to a close, we see that this was apparently quite the party. The phrase ends, they all got merry together, or essentially they're all drunk. They all had some more shindig. Well, the next morning, as we move into chapter 4, Joseph again set out to test his brothers. This time he instructed his stewards to fill their bags with grain and again put their money back in their bags. But this time he also told him to place his silver cup in the bag of his brother Benjamin. All of this, of course, without the brothers knowing. And so their bags are full. The next morning they get up and they head back home. But shortly after sending them on their way, Joseph sent his guards after them. And they are accused of stealing stealing Joseph's cup. The brothers are brought back to Egypt, and Joseph levels this accusation. He says, "I'm going to find which of you stole my cup, and when I do, I'm going to kill him. His life will be demanded of him." Well, the brothers cite their returning of the money from the first trip as the evidence of their innocence. They say, "Look, if we were criminals, why would we have given back the money you didn't take from us the first time? Is that the kind of thing criminals do?" But Joseph announces, he says, "Nope, not interested. Whoever has stolen my cup must die." And well, they begin to open the bags, and they find the cup in the bag of their brother Benjamin. But this time, the brothers freak out. Things had apparently changed. They cared for Benjamin more than they had cared for Joseph. They had seen what the loss of Joseph had done to their father, and this time, at least for Judah, this time things had to be different. And so Judah steps in. This is really Judah's finest hour. He delivers this eloquent speech recounting where they had been and how things had happened. And in verse 16, he even alludes to their guilt of the things they had done to Joseph. But Joseph says, no, it must be Benjamin. And Judah again intervenes, this time begging him to not put their father Jacob through the loss of Benjamin. It would simply be too much for him. Jacob had lost Joseph. Judah knew that his father could not handle the loss of Benjamin as well. And so in this moment we see that Judah was willing to spend the rest of his life in an Egyptian prison to save his father's happiness. Y'all, that is a spiritual transformation of the life of Judah from where we saw him 2 weeks ago in the account of he and Tamar. Judah's come a long way during this time. Well, as chapter 45 begins, Judah's speech was all too much for Joseph. He could not keep up this charade and game any longer, and he again broke down. He cleared the room of everyone but his brothers, and he disclosed his true identity to them. He said, I am your brother Joseph. And verse 4 tells us that they were dismayed. This is the same Hebrew word that's used for the fear that armies have in battle when they realize that all is lost. The brothers had that gut-wrenching, stomach-churning feeling in their stomach when they knew nothing good was about to happen. They must have felt that they were face to face with death. That Joseph was about to extract his revenge for the way they had treated him. And I don't think any of the brothers would have honestly blamed him for it. They knew what they had done was morally apprehensible. But you know the story. Joseph doesn't get revenge. He instead shows faith and forgiveness. He tells them that the things you meant for evil, God intended for good, and God has sent me here to preserve life. Joseph says, don't worry about it. I'm not going to kill you. You may have meant this for evil, but God has been at work in it all. And God is doing great things through me. He has sent me here to preserve life and bring about good from the midst of this evil. And not only does Joseph not seek revenge, he goes so far as to invite them to move to Egypt so that he can care for them personally throughout the remainder of the famine. Pharaoh heard about Joseph's brothers being there, and he gave them good land along the river, land good for grazing with their herds. He provided them with carts to move their things, move their goods and their stuff back home. Essentially, he says, here, have a moving truck. Let me pay for your U-Haul. And Joseph gave them clothes and gifts to take back. Benjamin was given an especially big gift. And Joseph sent them on their way back to their father to bring the family to Egypt. Can you imagine how much the brothers were dreading that conversation with their dad? For 20 years now, their father had assumed Jacob was dead, and the brothers were the reason he assumed that. And now they have to go explain how Joseph was not dead, that he had never been killed, that for 20 years they had let their father believe that because they had hated their brother so much. And not only was he not dead, he was in Egypt and inviting them home. Well, they get back, and we don't know how that conversation went on the brothers' end. But when Jacob heard the news, he didn't believe it. He was too shocked. He was too dismayed. But the more they went on the story, Jacob indeed realized, no, this is my son Joseph. And He is not dead, He is alive. And he was overjoyed. Chapter 45 ends with Jacob vowing to go down to Egypt because he was going to see his son before he died. The son whom he had been given back from the dead. This narrative in Genesis 42 through 45 is indeed one of the most powerful in Scripture. It's one of those stories that shows us what true and real biblical faith and trust in God looks like. And it's not one that conforms to what our world says. You see, as we begin to think about what this text means for our own lives, the thing we see more than anything else is the dichotomy between revenge and forgiveness. Joseph had every reason to want to seek revenge. He had every opportunity. He was the second most powerful man in Egypt. He was in a room alone with his good-for-nothing brothers, and he could have had them killed on the spot, and no one ever been the wiser, and there had been no repercussions because he was that powerful. But he doesn't, because he was not living according to the standards of the world. He was living according to the promise and the protection and provision of God. And when we live lives of true, genuine, biblical faith, we know that it's not our place to seek revenge. Vengeance is mine, thus says the Lord, I will repay. As Paul reminds us in Romans the 12th chapter. Instead, God calls us to turn the other cheek, to forgive as many times as it takes, and no matter how big the offense is, because biblical faith that has assurance and conviction, trusts that God is in control, even in the midst of evil. And that is powerful. But beyond reminding us of the importance of forgiveness rather than revenge, I think the story of Joseph and his brothers in chapters 42 through 45 also reminds us of another thing, that God is the healer of our hurt. The reality is that we are going to be hurt. People are going to do mean and bad things for us, and it can be easy to hold on to that grudge. But the only way we can heal that hurt is to let go of it. To turn it over to God. To ask Him to help us heal from the pain and to move toward forgiveness. Because that kind of forgiveness isn't found within us. It's found within God. And within an acknowledgement that God has forgiven us. And because of that, we too should forgive others. And so as we think about Genesis 42 through 45, may we strive to be more like Joseph. May we strive to be people who don't get caught up on the evil and the bad that happens to us, but who trust that God is at work to bring it together for good. That He who began a good work is faithful in us to bring it to completion. May we be people who are mindful of the forgiveness we have received, the mercy and grace we have received, and try to show that same forgiveness and mercy and grace to others. And may we be people who turn our hurt over to God, that we can heal, and be people who reflect love and joy rather than pain and bitterness. Joseph shows us all of these things, and in this regard truly represents the climax of the story of Genesis. But God isn't done with the family of Jacob just yet. He still has other plans to bless them. But exactly how God's going to do that even in Egypt, well, we'll look at that next week.